Hello and welcome to the Incubator, the Biology Jobology podcast. I am your host, Will Olds. This month we are exploring big and small biotech. Representing the big biotech, we will be joined by Dr. Ben Haley, who is group leader in the molecular biology department at Genentech. Representing the small startup biotech side is Dr. Sean Landrette, who's a senior research scientist at LAM Therapeutics in Guilford, Connecticut. So, first up is Ben Haley. All right, so what do you do now? What's a typical day for you?
So my position at Genentech is that of a senior scientist, which is someone who runs a research lab, typically with 1 to maybe upwards of 3 or 4 reports, and those can range from master's level, typically in the PhD range in terms of expertise, with some postdoc experience, but that's not necessary. And that's pretty typical of the research labs here at Genentech. And we have, a sort of a stratification of research responsibilities. There's basic research, which is where I am. But then there's developmental research, manufacturing research, those sorts of things, which get you a little bit closer to the clinic. In my particular lab, we're devoted to technology development, and it's a somewhat unique lab within Genentech itself and perhaps across biopharma in general. And the purpose of my lab is essentially to identify, vet, develop, and eventually implement various technologies for genetic manipulation. And that really covers the full gamut of things that we do at Genentech for research, because we use cell lines, which are the primary system that we work with for pretty much everything at the company.
What led you to Genentech particularly?
What led me here? That's a great question. So I actually had zero inclination for going into industry when I was a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, and also during my postdoc at UC Berkeley. And I was pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool Drosophila geneticist, basic molecular biologist. But as it turns out, the focus of my research, both for graduate work and for my postdoc work, was for genetic manipulation using RNA interference or other ways to manipulate transcription and translation to enhance or to suppress gene expression. And it turns out when I was doing my postdoc, I had very generous funding from the American Cancer Society. And one of the events the American Cancer Society was putting on, at least at the time, was a so-called Meet the Researchers Expo. And one of these Meet the Researchers Expos, which is essentially a science fair for funded researchers by the American Cancer Society, to have essentially a viewing of their research by the public who are invited to a conference room, wherever it may be. And one of these events was held at Genentech, and it was my first time going to the Genentech campus. It was in a conference room, which actually turned out to be in the building where I set up my lab at Genentech. And at this particular event, we set up our posters very much like a science fair. You essentially put them up on a table. There are these 3-way folding posters standing up. And the public comes in and will go through your poster and you explain what you do, why you do it, how you do it, etc. And again, I was the Drosophila biologist, or I was a Drosophila biologist at the time. And no one else in the room, none of the other American Cancer Society funded researchers were studying, I guess, these non-traditional model organisms for cancer biology. Everyone else was either a nurse studying patients, people working in human cell lines, or other mammalian cell lines studying cell division, that sort of thing. And so I was kind of off on this other spectrum. And the person who introduced me, because there was essentially an MC introducing each of the researchers. There were about 15 of us. Introduced me as the obscura category, and in a sort of tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic way. And in the room was this guy, Mark Tessier-Levine, who at the time was an executive vice president at Genentech and is now I don't know if he started yet, but he'll be the president at Stanford. And he heard this, his ears perked up. He looked over at me, he went over, grabbed the microphone, and essentially gave the entire history of Drosophila genetic screens and how important they were for identifying genes like Notch, hedgehog, et cetera, things that people now study as core cancer drivers or core cancer components. And I was just blown away that, you hear all this talk about industry and people being, pretty buttoned up and very focused on, whatever drug or whatever molecule they were interested in at the time, but really nothing else. And to hear this, very prominent scientists, go into the history of cancer biology in a way that I wasn't necessarily expecting really impressed me. And so that sort of got me thinking about life at Genentech for a research career. Not necessarily other companies, because again, this is my only exposure to industry. And then eventually a job came up that asked for someone with experience in RNA interference, which is what my background was in. And I applied, and I think the timing worked out well, and I passed the interview, and they hired me into the role. And so that's how I ended up here.
Was it strange to do this work with mammalian cell lines when your background was in fruit fly genetics?
It was actually something that I was looking forward to. Around the time that I applied, one other level to the story about why I went into industry was that this is around 2010 when I started looking, and in terms of the history of NIH funding and whatnot, 2010 was at the end of the essentially stimulus package for biomedical research or academic biomedical research. And so this is a period where there was a lot of hiring through maybe 2007 to end of 2009, and then it just went off a cliff. And I knew a lot of people in the Drosophila world in particular that were actually being offered faculty positions only to have them taken away months before they were going to start. So it was a really dark time. And also there was some stagnation in the field. I think there wasn't quite the advanced technology that we have now with CRISPR and other genetic manipulation techniques. And so I was looking for a bit of a change around that time. And being able to essentially use my expertise with genetic manipulation in Drosophila in another system wouldn't be a huge stretch. Genes are regulated in roughly the same way in pretty much every organism. And so it's just a matter of applying my knowledge to that new system. And again, that was a challenge I was looking forward to.
How did you prepare yourself during your academic years for this job?
Very, very little, actually.
That's a great answer.
Yeah. So I'm speaking from those individuals who really did nothing to market themselves for industry. That said, my background again within the field of RNA interference or genetic manipulation sort of plays itself well for translating to an industry career, because you can really apply that background to pretty much any question or pretty much any target within the biopharma space. So whether I'm working in cancer, immunology, et cetera, you're probably going to be expressing genes or downregulating genes or knocking out genes or adding or removing SNPs and tags and those sorts of things. So again, it can be applied pretty broadly. And so I think that actually helped me get my foot in the door. And actually during a few poster sessions when I was a graduate student, again, working with RNA interference, which was a hot thing at the time, this is in the mid-2000s, several company representatives approached me and asked if I was interested in industry. And of course, at that time I wasn't. But I think, being in a hot field and having the kind of expertise that can translate across disciplines definitely helps with that industry position down the road. And again, the other thing that helped me was probably having quite a few friends in industry, just by virtue of being friends with people in my particular field, but also friends from graduate school, friends from postdoc, because so many people are exploring the non-academic route for their careers nowadays, that I could talk with them and figure out what companies were good, what life is like at companies. And as it turns out, I think the way that I was able to get my foot in the door most strongly at Genentech in particular was the individual I shared my postdoc bench with. She went off and joined Genentech, and she was actually the one who put my name into the internal reference pool. And that is absolutely critical, at least at big companies, to have that inside connection to put you on that pile for the internal reference pool. And we can talk about that later, what that means and how to do that. But I think that's absolutely critical.
Yeah, so let's go into that now. I would like to hear more about that.
Sure. So in terms of hiring, and I've now hired multiple people and served on different interview committees at all different levels. By and large, most of the candidates that come in for interviews have some connection to someone at the company. And that's not nepotism per se. It's to me familiarity. And I am going to take the advice of someone that I know and trust and that I've built a relationship with at the company, who will then provide me with that recommendation or provide me with that CV, over just a blind CV that's been sent into the system and somehow made it through based on a number of keywords. And a critical feature in this is just the number of CVs that we get for each position. And it's going to fluctuate year to year, position to position. But typically we receive, many dozens, if not hundreds of CVs for any given position. And it's really hard to spend enough time to get to know the individual through the CV when you have so many to look through. And so again, having that personal connection somewhere in the company, or maybe having a mentor or something like that, make that phone call, I think is extremely helpful. And this holds true in academia as well as industry. It's good to have friends in high places, essentially, who can make that call for you.
So it seems like networking is key here. What advice would you like to give to people?
So in terms of networking, really just don't be shy. I think, one of the things about research is that pretty much everyone likes to talk about themselves in research and the work that they're doing at any given time. So if you happen to go to a conference, and you should go to as many conferences as you can, as many local or national or international conferences as you can, just go and start up a conversation with someone if you have even a passing interest in their work. They'll love to talk with you, and every individual that you meet could potentially be someone that can help you down the road, or potentially you help them down the road. And so I think the lesson is just don't be shy. And I'm speaking of someone, or from hindsight at this point in my career. I probably didn't get out and do it as much as I should have, at the very least as a graduate student. I did it a little bit more as a postdoc. But it is important to get out there and know people and let people know who you are and what you're interested in.
What's been the biggest challenge for you during this transition to industry?
The biggest challenge for me, there are a number of challenges. I would say the biggest challenge for me, because I'm in a managerial position, has been balancing the laboratory work with what would be the equivalent of service roles within industry. Again, in an academic environment, your service roles would be serving on thesis committees and that sort of thing. In industry, there are quite a few of these particular service roles that I wasn't anticipating. For example, we serve on different research review committees to review projects, either at the early stage or at the very late stage. And more recently, I've been getting involved in several business development opportunities, providing input for those particular groups who are thinking about either purchasing companies, merging with companies, or just investing further in different technologies. And these are committee responsibilities or service responsibilities that you can't necessarily anticipate at any given time. They just show up because sometimes opportunities, sometimes projects just happen. So That's been unexpected. And also the laboratory work is kind of interesting. So for most people in industry, as you start up your lab, and I'm still a relatively junior lab head, most junior lab heads in industry are expected to spend a significant portion of their time at the bench. And so when you're managing individuals working in the lab and also, having these service roles, your time can get pretty thin and you can get stretched quite a bit. And so I think it's that balance. And I don't think people appreciate just how hard you have to work in industry to, keep growing your lab in effect and keep doing interesting things.
When you're doing this computation in your mind, how do you decide to do this versus that?
That's actually quite difficult. My inclination is always to root for the underdog, to help the most junior PIs get off their feet and help with their particular projects. But ultimately, you balance. You look at the overall scope of the project, whether your contributions at that moment are something that are necessary to move that project forward, or if it's something that you can potentially put off for a week or 2 weeks or maybe even a month, or can you outsource those particular projects? That's a big thing in industry at the moment, at least where I am. And it's trying to find that balance between again, what you can contribute to in a meaningful way at that moment versus what might not necessarily need your help that very second, and what you can push back for a little while or push off onto a CRO, for example.
What are the cultural differences between academia and industry?
The culture in industry versus academia. This is an excellent question. One of the things that I miss about academia in particular is I felt like individuals were a little more open with their personal opinions, their personal beliefs, and also their language. I come from a couple academic labs that were very much like the locker room style, people kind of ribbing on each other all the time, and really just people getting along with each other in a way that you don't necessarily have in industry. I think people in industry are much more professional, much more buttoned up, and I think I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I think people come in, they do their job, they're very focused on their job, and they aren't necessarily growing up like many individuals are in an academic environment. They're not necessarily in need of constant mentorship. And so I think that dynamic is quite different in an industry lab versus in an academic lab.
So I'm curious about the role of basic research in industry in Genentech. The goals seem similar to academia. You want to find something cool, something interesting. But in academia, you are incentivized to publish in Science, Nature, and so on. What are your incentives in this industry setting?
Yeah, so again, that's a good question. So the incentives are different, I think, partly because of the difference in culture. And it's a difference in culture which I didn't necessarily allude to earlier. And that's when you work in industry, you're really working as a collective as opposed to an individual. And so your incentives are team incentives more often than not. And whereas in academia, it's critical to be the sole first author or sole last author on a publication. In industry, if your individual contribution is what puts a particular project to the point where you can patent a small molecule or patent a particular disease, patent a particular concept related to a disease, you can publish a paper, with your chemistry team, with your biology team, with your clinical development team, all those sorts of things. Again, the team benefits from that, and the incentives come from this collective mindset and this collective attitude. Outside of that, I think there are personal benefits. Certainly when you work in industry, there are bonuses based on performance, where you might not necessarily have that in academia. And so certain people are, I think everyone in some degree is motivated by, having that extra pat on the back. And so I think that also incentivizes people to work harder, smarter, more effectively.
What are the most rewarding and exciting parts of your job?
The most rewarding and exciting, I think it's been true from the day that I entered the lab as a graduate student to today. It's discovering new things, and one of the main reasons that I chose my particular position is that we still are in a basic research discovery mode, and so even if that's working with existing technology or maybe going through the literature, working through our business development group, identifying new but potentially unexplored or fully explored technologies, finding ways to adapt those in ways that people didn't think was possible, or at scales people didn't think were possible, is definitely the most rewarding for me. And separate from that, it's been developing my research group to the point where there have been situations I walk in lab and they're having conversations with each other about projects which I hadn't even considered, or about experiments which I hadn't even considered, and it's really watching them grow or continue to grow as scientists that makes me feel quite proud and quite happy to be working with them.
What's the typical career trajectory for those in biotech and biopharma?
So I can only speak for Genentech on that, but Genentech has perhaps a unique research trajectory or career trajectory for their researchers. My track is that of a managerial track, and I started out on that track. So I started as a scientist. I was promoted recently to senior scientist, and then it'll go to a couple different levels, always with that scientist title. Other tracks are more of a technical track, so I guess you could call it an individual contributor track. And those are people that spend the majority of their time at the bench, although they will be leading projects and they may have reports assigned to them. And there are other managerial tracks somewhere in between or somewhat parallel to what I do. And what's interesting is that these tracks really do work for particular personality types, particular work balance types, and different research interests. I always wanted to run a research lab that was devoted to technology development. I just happened to get lucky that this one came along, but there are certainly research tracks that allow you to oversee specific disease indications and discovery projects there. Clinical development programs related to specific disease indications or specific targets. And, I can't necessarily speak to other career tracks within the company, but one thing that I've been impressed by since joining a relatively large company is just the breadth of career possibilities for individuals with a research background. Again, we have people in our public relations department that have scientific backgrounds. They are able to read and vet and send out press releases related to different discoveries at Genentech. There are people in clinical development who sift through sample data and then provide that information either to physicians or to researchers to better make sense of that data, maybe to improve the clinical trials or identify very specific individuals who might be benefiting from those clinical trials, statisticians, bioinformaticians. There's a whole range of opportunities for people with research backgrounds that, I didn't quite appreciate before starting at this company.
That's really cool. I didn't even know that. So, biotech has lots of mergers and acquisitions. What are good ways to keep your footing amidst the chaos?
Yeah, so, this is a good question. So one aspect of my career at Genentech has been one of constant change, in that for my first 4 years at the company, I had 3 direct managers and 4 directors. And that was due to people.
Holy cow.
Yeah, so that's due to people retiring. So two directors ended up retiring throughout that time. Project realignments, departmental realignments, fractioning, regrow, or reconnection, all those sorts of things. And that's going to be pretty common when you work in industry. We haven't had any mergers that affected my particular position. But one of the things that I've learned throughout this process is to never take anything personally, in that there are a lot of decisions that are going to be made without your input, and for reasons that you won't necessarily understand. They'll be other business or research related, who knows? They may affect who you report to, why you report to them, what your projects are at any given time. But again, just knowing that as long as you are putting in your best effort and you are doing your best at the job, then these are things that are just going to happen. And it's one of these things which I sort of anticipated going into the job, knowing sort of how industry works, or from an outsider's perspective. But I didn't quite appreciate how it may affect you as an individual. And one of the things that I've learned throughout this process too is that when it comes to realignment in different departments or with different companies or whatnot through these mergers and acquisitions, and again, just department changes, just how important it is to click with your direct manager. And I think ultimately that's the one thing that I found to be the most important, at least on a day-to-day basis, for job satisfaction in industry. And it's something that you don't necessarily notice when you're in academia because you're so focused on your projects and getting that done. But in industry, your direct manager does have a lot of influence in terms of what you're doing on a day-to-day, and how you're judged at the end of the day as well. And that's something that a lot of people can take personally. And again, I've learned to sort of grow a thick skin when it comes to those sorts of things.
When were you most discouraged about your career, and what got you through it?
I think the sort of what I just alluded to with respect to the constant change, that's something that did affect me because I had built up momentum on various projects, and things had changed at some point in a way that it did not allow me to continue working on those projects, and so they just kind of had to dangle. And I think it's hard to leave something after you've worked for a year and a half or 2 years to get something started, knowing that there's momentum, knowing that it can go somewhere, and then you have to shift on a dime. But again, I've learned that good projects will always come back. And so I sort of keep those particular projects and that knowledge in my back pocket, and I try to translate that and apply it to my existing projects. So try to work a little bit faster if I can, or know that the projects can shift at any given time, just based on priorities.
Science is frustrating, whatever level you're on. What mental health tips do you have?
Mental health tips? No, hopefully once you've made it through graduate school, and if you've had some postdoc experience, you've kind of been put through the ringer. You know what failure feels like. I think even the most successful scientists have probably failed more often than they've succeeded. It's just taking those experiences and building off of those experiences and translating those into more effective experiments and more effective management of your time. And I think these are just things that you learn as you grow as a scientist. What projects make sense, which ones don't, how you can best contribute to certain projects, where you can provide meaningful insight, where you might not be able to. And it's just taking that body of knowledge that you've accumulated and applying it in the most effective way.
How's work-life balance in your job?
Work-life balance is tricky. I am sort of an obsessive compulsive when it comes to research. It's the one thing that drives me day to day. It's pretty much the only thing I want to do all the time. And so I'm lucky that I am and I run a lab that is devoted to basic research, in particular the basic research that I love the most. But that certainly does eat into a work-life balance. I'm here past working hours. I'm here on weekends very often, just sort of playing around in lab, trying to come up with some new ideas, finishing up experiments, and trying to explore new things. And I know a lot of people don't necessarily have that luxury because of their particular positions or their life circumstances. But it's something that I certainly relish about my particular circumstance. Do I wish I had more free time outside of the lab? Sure. But again, because I genuinely do enjoy the minute by minute, day by day work that I do in the lab, it's something that I don't necessarily think too much about.
Do you have any other suggestions for those wanting to enter into biotech?
Get to know as many people as you can who work in biotech. I think there are certain perceptions about life in biotech, and there are perceptions about life at certain companies in biotech or pharma in general. And you really only learn what life is like by knowing people who are behind the walls and do that work day to day. And certainly try and get in touch with people who work within different disciplines in these companies. Again, there's a whole swath of research and non-research career opportunities for people in biotech. And I think it's important to figure out which things you might be interested in, which things you might be good at, and hopefully where you can combine those two particular aspects. Because I do know a lot of people who are, adamant about a certain position, and when they try it, it turns out it just isn't for them. And it's not necessarily the company or, anything else related to the circumstance. It just turns out that it wasn't quite what they thought it was going to be. And if you talk with people who are in those positions, or potentially even better, do internships at any company, I think those are things that will definitely help you not just get your foot in the door at the company, but figure out which door you want to stick your foot in. And so, yeah.
Yeah, especially because, as you said earlier, there's so many things beyond using a pipette and being the manager.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, just the business development opportunities that I've been in more recently have exposed me to some of these different worlds. For example, in one room, most recently, we had our clinical operations team who is involved in clinical trial design. We had people involved in commercial who set prices. We had people involved in business development in general who are constantly fielding emails or sending out flyers to different companies about in-licensing or out-licensing different technologies from the company. 3 or 4 different research disciplines, including myself, manufacturing, and just seeing, this room of about 20 people, and there are 20 different disciplines related to this company in that room was kind of impressive to me.
Lastly, what are words of encouragement you have for young scientists?
Words of encouragement, again, just use that body of experience that you've built up throughout graduate school, throughout your postdoc, and just in life in general, and know that, if you just keep hammering away at it in a smart way and in an efficient way, you should be able to get what you want, get that position that you want. But yeah, it's really, network, do your best in the lab, and things should play out.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, no problem. This is fun.
Big thanks to Ben. So next up is Sean Landrette, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a senior research scientist at a biotech startup. All right, Sean. So what do you do now? What's a typical day for you?
Currently, I work for a startup biotech company. In a startup, you kind of have to wear many hats. For us, a typical day ranges from reviewing scientific literature and designing and conducting experiments, all the way to evaluating pharmacodynamic markers and samples from ongoing clinical trials, and reviewing and instructing outside contract research organizations on in vivo models to test drug efficacy.
I was wondering if you could go through your career story.
My career story is pretty typical for a PhD. I was a biotechnology undergraduate major, and I was interested in experimental science and disease-focused research. So then after undergraduate, I pursued a PhD and continued to be interested in disease-related research, and then continued on to do a postdoc.
Could you speak about how, once you figured out that you wanted to go into industry, how you prepared yourself for that?
During my PhD and postdoc, I worked to publish papers. I wrote and secured grants for funding to kind of get more experience in that arena. And also I participated in scientific meetings to kind of, again, present my data and work to network with other scientists.
Anything else that you did besides the talks and networking?
Outside the lab, I worked to continue to network with previous associates that I had worked with during my PhD and postdoc. And also, I participated in the career development programs put together by my graduate school and also the Postdoc Association.
So, switching gears, what was the most valuable skill you learned in graduate school and postdoc?
I would say the most valuable skill I developed and am continuing to work to improve is the precise description and interpretation of scientific data, whether that is in the written form, in manuscripts and patent applications, or in oral presentations.
What's been the biggest challenge for you as you've transitioned from the academic bench to industry?
I would say the biggest challenge would be the accelerated pace of the science in industry. You want to make a decision very fast to be able to determine, which avenue you're going to take and whether a project is worthwhile to pursue or not.
So you've already mentioned that it's much more fast-paced. What other cultural aspects could you speak on?
Industry is much more focused on getting effective drugs to the patients as soon as possible. Well, I found that academia was more intellectually driven. So the research was more circuitous in that you could, if you found an interesting result, you could, follow up on that and, do experiments to look at what was causing that obscure result. But definitely in industry, the goal is just to get focused and try to get those drugs to patients as soon as possible.
So what's the most rewarding and exciting part of your job?
Definitely the most exciting and rewarding parts of the job are being able to make contributions that accelerate drug discovery to get those drugs to patients in need.
So what's the most challenging part of your job?
Again, the accelerated pace of decision-making in drug discovery makes it a little bit more challenging. And you're constantly needing to prioritize your tasks and also being able to balance multiple tasks and projects at the same time to make sure you're continuing on the most efficient path forward.
So how are you developing yourself now?
I'm continuing to network with colleagues and keep abreast of what's going on in the biotech industry.
So when were you most discouraged about your career and what got you through it?
I would say the most discouraging part of my career, which I'm sure many scientists go through, is during the publication process. In a project where we thought we had good results, but prior to when we went to publish, other scientists published similar results prior to our submission, so it just made the whole process of publishing that much more harder. And we just weren't able to get our results into those journals we were hoping to get them into. In science, there's going to be a lot of failures, and you just have to work through it, move on to that next result, that next paper, that next project.
On a similar note, do you have any mental health tips?
I would just say to remember to take some time for yourself, to take a break from the science, and spend some time with your friends and family just to recharge for that next project or that next long day of experiments.
From your description, it sounds like you do a little bit of everything. How do you strike that work-life balance in your work?
Since I'm working in a startup company right now, and we're working to secure investments and funding, I would say it's definitely shifted more towards the work side than the life side, just because you have to put in that much more time and work with the limited resources that you have to be able to get the projects pushed forward as soon as possible.
Many colleagues have told me that developing their networking skills is the most challenging part of this transition to the world beyond academia. What tips do you have?
I would just advise to keep up with your connections you have made throughout your career in your PhD, postdoc, and undergrad, and also work to gain new connections and networks by involving yourself in journal clubs and participating in meetings where you're able to meet new scientists and make those connections.
Besides working to maintain those relationships, do you have any other suggestions for those interested in entering biotech?
I would say to learn as much as you can about the field through career fairs, networking events, and connections with people that you already know working in the biotech field.
So what words of encouragement do you have for young scientists?
I would say just to keep working hard and realize that your discoveries can make an important impact on society and human health. And that's just an exciting, rewarding thing that's in this career path. So I would just keep working hard and, you can achieve those goals.
Big thanks to Ben and Sean for their contributions and to Protein Tech for sponsoring. And thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes. See you next month.